Mr. President, are we in a quorum call?
We are.
Ask unanimous consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last Friday, I went back to the city of Chicago I'm honored to represent. And over the weekend, had two experiences I want to share with you. There was a real contrast, but there was a recurring theme in both. The first was at a church in the city of Chicago on Friday, Christ Lutheran Church. It's on Wilson Avenue in a section of Chicago known as Albany Park. The church was built in 1911. You look around at the houses outside that church and you think, this neighborhood's seen a lot of change, a lot of different people who came through with waves of immigration. Today it's predominantly Hispanic, but I would imagine that the march of history would take you through many other groups that lived in the Albany Park neighborhood. The pastor there is named Tom Terrell. I was meeting him for the first time. We had a press conference inside his little church, and he told us a story of what had happened at his church, Christ Lutheran Church in Albany Park in Chicago, on the previous Sunday. There aren't as many people in his church as there were just a few months ago because a lot of them are too afraid. They're Hispanic families, and they're afraid if they go to that church, they might be detained or arrested or something else terrible might happen. But some brave souls made it to the Christ Lutheran Church on that Sunday, and Pastor Terrell told us the story. At the end of the ceremony at noon, the people were leaving and heading home, walking away from church, when an unmarked van pulled up and ICE agents came out of it and started to ask questions of the people that just came out of church. It was noticed in the neighborhood, and what is now becoming more common in Chicago, the neighbors started coming out with whistles, standing on the front porch and blowing whistles because the ICE agents were intimidating these people who were just leaving church. Eventually, enough people started blowing whistles that the ICE agents decided to tear gas the people coming out of church. They threw the tear gas canisters, got in their van, and left. Going to church on Sunday in Albany Park in the city of Chicago was an opportunity for an ICE raid. That's what's happening in the city of Chicago, and it's not confined to that neighborhood. It's happening there and in the surrounding suburbs. Are the people afraid? You bet they are. They're afraid of what's going to happen to them and their families. The stories come pouring in, one after the other. Remember how we got started in this conversation? Remember when the president said at his rallies over and over again, we're going after rapists, terrorists, murderers, those who are criminally insane, and those who are predators of children. They came into this country illegally and they're not going to stay. Well, Christ Lutheran Church was not the place to visit if you're looking for those categories. Those people there were not guilty of any crimes other than going to church, if that's a crime in the eyes of some. It certainly isn't in my eyes. That's the reality. 70% of the people who are being detained and arrested in the city of Chicago have no criminal record. No criminal record. And yet they're being intimidated. The restaurants in many parts of the city aren't what they used to be. People are not going shopping. They're afraid to go outside at all. That's the reality. My second experience this week in Chicago is on the same theme. Mr. President, on Saturday, an estimated 7 million Americans across this country took to the streets peacefully with a singular message to President Trump and his enablers. We have no kings in the United States. That included 100,000 people in Chicago, and I was proud to be one of them. That's the front line, as we know, of the president's assault on our democracy, our civil liberties, and our rule of law. Now, I've been in Congress for 4 decades, so believe me when I say that the turnout in this march was the largest I've ever seen at any political gathering. It was amazing. The president is trying to tell the world that it's unsafe to be in the city of Chicago. Well, the weekend before this, we had our 53,000 runners in the Chicago Marathon with tens of thousands of supporters and family cheering them on. They weren't afraid to be in Chicago, and neither was I. And this last Saturday, this gathering of people in the city of Chicago, without violence, expressing themselves as Americans, disagreeing with our government, which is part of democracy, was a peaceful gathering by and large. I joined the march in the city of Chicago and carried a sign that read, "Hands off Chicago," and I meant it. Chicago is a great city. It faces challenges, but all cities face challenges. These challenges must be addressed with solutions that are consistent with our American values. This president is abusing his power by fueling this cruel immigration raid policy, unleashing the military, bringing in National Guard men and women from the state of Texas against immigrants and citizens alike. Don't believe me? I'll show you. The president claims his actions are meant to round up, quote, the worst of the worst, but that's been anything but the case. A few weeks ago, Chicago and the nation watched in horror as women and children, immigrants and U.S. citizens alike, were dragged from their homes in South Shore of Chicago, detained with the use of zip ties. Imagine your child rousted out of bed in the middle of the night when the front door of your apartment is crashed down, and that child is taken downstairs, separated from his mother and father with a zip tie, holding his hands together. When one witness complained that these children are being mistreated, I'm sorry to tell you, the person from ICE said, F them kids. And just last week, ProPublica reported that in the first 9 months of the Trump administration, ICE held over 170 American citizens across the country, kicking, dragging, beating, and detaining some of them for days. Let me repeat, they were American citizens. Take Maria Greeley, a Chicagoan and U.S. citizen detained by federal agents earlier this month in Chicago. She showed them her passport, but they zip-tied her and held her for hours because she, quote, didn't look like someone named Greeley. Let me give you another example. On October the 3rd, Juan Munoz, trustee for the township of Oak Park in Illinois, stood with protesters outside the ICE Broadview processing facility along with other elected officials. Federal agents picked him out of the crowd, shoved him to the ground, and arrested him while they left his colleagues alone. They held him for 8 hours. Why did they hold Juan Munoz for that long and not his colleagues? He was a person of color. Does this sound like the work of an administration set on reducing violent crime? I think not. This cruelty is all for show. While Americans continue to pay inflated prices at the checkout aisle and face the prospect of skyrocketing healthcare premium costs, this is what our president is focusing on. We, the people, stood up this weekend to the president's abuses of power. I hope the Supreme Court, when the time comes, will do the same. The founders of this nation designed the Constitution to protect generations of Americans from the very abuses we are watching unfold before our eyes today. They understood the dangers of a military turned against its own people and limiting their role in civilian affairs. President Trump's claims of so-called invasions, rebellions, emergencies to justify calling the military into American cities like Chicago are baseless. They are simply attempts to bypass laws and the checks and balances of the Constitution. Judges in Portland, Oregon, and Chicago, Illinois, appointed by presidents of both political parties, have agreed. In upholding a ruling temporarily barring the deployment of troops in Chicago, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals concluded, and I quote, "The facts do not justify the president's actions in Illinois. Political opposition is not rebellion." In fact, the court noted the Department of Homeland Security itself claims that protests have not slowed down their operations and that ICE has increased its deportations and arrests. Political opposition, peaceful protests, Even nonviolent civil disobedience are not rebellion. They are the bedrocks of our democracy. And if there are legitimate concerns with maintaining law and order, protecting public safety, and controlling crime, the Constitution preserves the power to address that to the states, not the federal government. Whether in Chicago, Portland, Los Angeles, Memphis, or the District of Columbia, it is civilian authorities, state and local law enforcement, that have the primary responsibility for enforcing the law. I'm glad to see federal judges, including judges appointed by President Trump himself, upholding their constitutional responsibility to interpret the law and apply it to the facts. It's no surprise that President Trump is now asking the Supreme Court's conservative supermajority to greenlight his abuse of power and allow him to deploy troops regardless of statutory limit or the actual facts on the ground. The Supreme Court should reject the president's petition. There is no emergency that would justify bypassing the regular appeals process and resolving this case on the court's shadow docket without full public scrutiny that it deserves. My warning to my Republican colleagues is this. Durbin of Illinois is standing on the floor of the Senate today telling you what's happening to the state and people I love to represent. If the president is allowed to send the military against his own citizens in Chicago without regard to the laws enacted by Congress, what guardrails are left to preventing him from doing it to you in your home state, to the people that you are proud to represent here in the Senate? We cannot sit idly by while a person who wants to be king takes us down the path to authoritarianism. Madam President, I yield the floor.